All right, thank you everyone for joining us today. Making sure no one's in the waiting room. All right, so I'm very excited today. So this is the third and final session in a series we're hosting. I know some of you have been here, and those are in person. Many of you, weren't able to join for the rest of the session. Those are online, especially. So this series is on the intersecting spheres of mathematics, art, and spirituality, explorations in Islamic geometry. And I'm very excited today to have a wonderful panel of international experts, actually, from 3 different countries. So we're really fortunate to have this panel of 4 experts. So the way it's going to work today is I'm going to start, I'll first do introductions of our panelists, and then I'm going to ask a series of questions from the panel, and covering a range of topics related to Islamic geometry. And then hopefully we will have quite a bit of time at the end. I think I have so many questions that I might have to not ask all of them to leave time for the rest of you to be able to ask some questions as well. So without further ado, let's get started. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in, I could do it in the order you see them, that might be more helpful. I was going to do alphabetical order. Maybe I'll just do it in the order from top to bottom so you can connect faces to biographies. Let me maybe actually make this bigger. I'll see. Actually, I don't need to share the screen anymore. Okay, well now it's not top to bottom anymore, but we will go. Well, I'll figure out how to do this. Maybe I'll just point at the person, or you can see their names. Okay, so our first panelist is Carol Beer, who is a scholar and curator in the field of Islamic art with broad-ranging publications of books, book chapters, articles, encyclopedia entries, and reviews in academic journals. She is currently a research scholar at the Center for Islamic Studies of the Graduate Theological Union in Northern California. Her current research focuses on the intersectionality of art and mathematics and patterns in Islamic art and architecture as, quote, geometry made manifest. She is interested in understanding the deep cultural significance of historical Islamic ornament, not as decorative and non-representational, but as expressive of geometry, representing an emergent intersection in the trajectories of the history of mathematics, history of architecture, and philosophy. She is also concurrently a research associate at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C., where she previously served as a curator of the Eastern Hemisphere collection from 1984 to 2001. So it's a lot of deep experience, both as a curator and as a researcher. And by the way, if I make any mistakes or some of what I mentioned or in any of your biographies outdated, just let me know. Feel free to correct me. Our next panelist on the top right is Samira Mian. Samira uses her background in mathematics and education to share her knowledge and artistic passion, breathing new life into the centuries-old technique of using straight edge and compass to recreate geometric patterns from the Islamic lens. She researches and analyzes the geometry of these patterns to create intriguing and beautiful art. She's not necessarily a traditional artist and enjoys working intuitively, reimagining these great patterns with a fresh eye in contemporary colors and styles. Last year, she was commissioned to complete her first public artwork as part of a local project called Northwell Art Stops in West London. She also completed her first brand collaboration with Porsche Middle East as the artist of the 2024 Porsche Ramadan campaign. She produced a range of contemporary designs which were used for the month of Ramadan and Eid by Porsche centers and partners across the Middle East in their social media promotions, showrooms, and beyond. For the last 8 years, she has regularly led workshops in the UK, abroad, as well as reaching many online through live and recorded classes, social media, and her YouTube channel. Her biggest motivation is to share this intellectual and beautiful heritage from the Islamic lens and the immensely satisfying pursuits they involve with the widest possible audience. Next, in the bottom left, making sure my geometry is correct. Okay, Eric Brugge is an author, educator, and artist specialized in Islamic architecture and geometric design. He's been active in Islamic geometric design for over 25 years and is passionate about the creative and educational opportunities this design tradition offers to a wide range of audiences. He's written several books on Islamic geometric patterns and Islamic art more broadly. His most recent book, Islamic Architecture or World History, and I don't know if you have it, but I saw Carol had a copy if you want to display it.
I do.
There it is.
Oh,
it was
thank you.
And it beautifully depicts Islamic architecture and its influence around the world. He also works on public projects, including a 4 by 9 meter composition made of water jet cut ceramic tiles that was created for the new Zachariah Education Center in Dewsbury, West Yorkshire in 2019. Eric has an MA degree in the history of Islamic art and architecture from the School of Oriental and African Studies in London and did 1 year at the Prince's School of Traditional Arts. He gives workshops and lectures around the world and is a consultant on various educational and design projects in the Middle East and elsewhere. And for those who attended our first workshop, we actually did one of the construction patterns that was in Eric's book.
Oh, really?
So,
no, thank you.
The first one, I think the simplest, one of the simplest ones. And finally, we have Craig Kaplan, who is an associate professor in the School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo. He is interested in a broad range of interdisciplinary topics with a particular focus on interactions between mathematics and art. He uses mathematical ideas to create tools and algorithms that generate ornamental patterns or that empower artists and designers. His work frequently incorporates knowledge from computer graphics, classical and computational geometry, human-computer interaction, graph theory, symmetry and tiling theory, and perceptual psychology. He has done a lot of work on computational Islamic geometry in particular, and was also involved in a major breakthrough discovery in tiling theory last year, which we'll discuss later in the pattern. So, sorry, in the panel. So I won't spoil that now. And I think, so that's our panelists. As you can see, they have a wide range of backgrounds, but all really converging. And I think many, if not all of them, sort of know each other because they're from a, maybe a niche community that actually studies Islamic geometry, but we see how it's such a, and as we've already seen in the past couple of sessions, those who are here, such an interdisciplinary area that draws from a lot of different fields and both, scholarly work as well as artistic work. And so we have all of that represented here on our panel. All right, so I'm going to start off by asking each of our panelists, so we can go in the order that I just introduced them, each panelist to briefly give just some introduction and basically how did you encounter and how did you become interested in this field of Islamic geometry? What brought you to this field? So please take 2 to 4 minutes to discuss that. So Carol, would you like to start? And I will share your.
Sure. I'm happy to begin. Geometry happened to be my favorite subject in high school. And then I joined the math team. It was an all-girls high school, and we competed against 2 all-boys high schools. This was in New York City. And we competed very well. And it was just mathematics in general was my favorite subject. In college, I had some bad experiences because I was the only girl in a class of 200 boys in calculus. And that persuaded me not to major in mathematics. And it was 40 years before I revisited my love of mathematics. And that was when I was curator at the Textile Museum in Washington, D.C. And I just was following my own, I guess, my own bliss, and hit upon symmetry and the study of pattern as what I wanted to focus on at the Textile Museum. So my first exhibition was on Visions of Infinity, and I positioned the carpets on the wall, many of them fragments, as you see on the left. I positioned them on the wall according to their axes of symmetry and points of rotation and axes of reflection and glide reflection and translation. And this was not how anybody had ever exhibited textiles before at the Textile Museum. And it created such reverberation within the room, like the objects really spoke to one another. So that was instructive to me, and I was just fascinated and pursued it further. Can you give me the next slide, or can I adjust it? I did a project as a consultant for the San Francisco Fine Arts Museums. Oh, let me just stop. I stepped down as curator because rather than being an exhibition machine and doing an exhibition every year, I had, after 20 years, decided I really wanted to devote myself to scholarship of Islamic geometric pattern as intersections of art and mathematics. My husband and I moved to California, and this slide is of a consulting position I had with the De Young Museum, San Francisco Fine Arts Museums, looking at carpet math in Turkmen carpets, looking at counting and numbers, units and counting, symmetry and algorithmic aesthetics, the repetition of a design to form a pattern by a particular algorithm. In Islamic art, that's usually symmetry. Next slide. Another exhibition that I had at the Textile Museum was Symmetry and Pattern, the Art of Oriental Carpets. And that came out of the inspiration of several art math conferences I had attended, and in particular, the Bridges organization. And Craig has been president of the Bridges organization, and that's how I know him. Can't remember how I met Eric, but it was certainly through one of the art math communities and conferences. And then I think we were in Istanbul together at the Istanbul Design Center. Next slide. This was a series of summer programs at Mount Holyoke University in Massachusetts with students from inner city high school level, mathematics for girls. It was called Summer Math. And I was delighted to be invited to be a teacher of that. It was a 2-week program, and we made patterns by cutting and folding and just entered into the realm of geometry and had a joyous 2 weeks together. I think the next slide is the last slide. That's me in Bukhara at the tomb of the Samanids. And on the right, a tympanum of a tomb tower in Iran. So my work on Islamic geometry has mainly focused on what is considered to be Islamic ornament, and from a Western art historical perspective, that is too often just considered to be decorative and non-representational. And my work has attempted to demonstrate that it is indeed profoundly significant, not as representation, but as expressive of geometry and the significance of geometry itself. Let me leave it at that and move on to Samira.
Thank you. Samir, I'll go ahead and share videos, but go
Okay.
feel free to start.
So I think similar to Carol, I loved maths and I loved art as a student. I think I assumed one would be something you do as your career and one would be something you have as a hobby. So for quite a while, that was the case. And then in 2013, I went to a course, a Saturday course with Art of Islamic Pattern. So Richard Henry and Adam Williamson. And it was my hobby until it wasn't. So at the same time, I was a maths teacher and I was a maths teacher for 12 years at secondary school. And I just had this desire to take time out. And then in that time out, I pursued these patterns a lot more. When you learn something like this, you want to kind of practice it and explore it a lot. And when I was a full-time teacher, I just didn't have the time. So then I took a year. Everyone, and welcome to. Sorry, let me. This evening's performance with Orchestra 1. I'm at the theatre. 15 minutes. Sorry about that. So yeah, so basically, I then was able to take time out and really practice it. And then in that time out, I was able to start teaching it. And because I hadn't taught for such a long time, I was really glad to have finally this thing I love so much, teaching, combine the two. And so since then, I've been able to run my own workshops. I've got courses online. And it's all about this process, like that you just saw, of drawing and creating. And then, rendering it in a modern and contemporary way, because I can't do the ceramics and woodwork and all the amazing materials of the past, but I can easily just take a compass, some colors, and whatever it might be, and create these patterns. So I think somehow in our modern lives, we don't really use our digits and our fingers. So the actual process, I think, is really satisfying, and you get a lot from it. So it's like you want to share that with everybody and at the same time celebrate this art form that kind of visits all these different corners of the Islamic lands and makes you realize there's a lot more to, I guess, places and people of the past than we imagine. So yeah, I do enjoy the processes. Yeah, I think I'll pause with the video there because that's about 2 minutes. Yeah, thank you.
Great. Sorry, I didn't play all of your videos, but
Do you know what? I think the speaker put me off, so yeah, don't worry. Well, I'll have time to speak. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I think those who are in the first panel can, looking at this, they saw how difficult it was. I mean, it was everyone's first time doing any of this, so it's quite difficult to actually do this work. So hopefully you can appreciate the amount of work that actually goes into this and the beauty of it. Thank you so much. So we'll move on to Eric.
Thank you. Well, Carol, first we met in Leiden first time.
Oh, okay.
Remember?
Great.
Yeah.
At the Lawrence Center.
Yeah, that's right.
Right,
That's
right. Thank you.
So my story, well, I'm from Holland, and I'm unlike everybody else here. I think I'm terrible at maths. I never enjoyed it in high school. It was really not my thing. I was much more into history. I am much more into history and languages and things like that. So I'm as surprised as anyone that I've churned out books on the subject. But that's how it was for me. I was studying Middle Eastern politics in Amsterdam, and I've always, certainly at that time, but still, I had a lot of creative energy and a real thirst for learning, and political science just wasn't doing it for me. It wasn't enough. It just wasn't enough. And I thought, well, I need to find something that will be enough, or that will be a big challenge for me. A big challenge, impossible dream, that sort of thing. And I'd always been interested in architecture. The first books that I bought for myself for money that I earned in high school were books on architecture. And then, studying Middle Eastern politics, these things sort of melded. So that was always my interest. But I really wanted to find something that would challenge me. And then I found a book in Amsterdam on Islamic geometric design, the book by Bourgoin, the Dover publication. And that's the first book that I bought. And I took it home, and I took it on holiday to Malta, I remember, with a compass and a ruler, and thought, right, this is going to be a good project. Let me see what I can do. And that's where I started trying to deconstruct these patterns, teaching myself, really, because there were a few books available at the time, but not very many at all, 2 or 3 maybe, that allowed you to learn something. But the Bourgoin book just shows you the result. Certainly in the Dover publication, it just shows you the result, not the process. So for me, for 10 years, that's what there you go. That for 10 years, that's what I did. Obsessively, really, because I thought also, if I, as a regular Dutch guy, I'm going to forego an education at university and pursue something as obscure as Islamic geometric design, then I better do it properly. So that's the deal I made with myself, that I would just go for it and keep going, basically. And that's what happened. So I taught myself for 10 years, and I made hundreds of drawings, and gradually sort of started to figure things out, and then went to London, or thought I needed a proper education. So went to London, sold my house in Amsterdam to pay for my education in the UK. Went to the Prince's School for a year, didn't like it very much, and went to SOAS instead, which I like much better. But for me, I like to explain things, and that's certainly the appeal for me with geometry, is that I like the teaching aspect very much. I mean, teaching myself I like very much, but also presenting it in such a way that it becomes accessible. That's always the thing that I've loved. That's always motivated me to do workshops and to do online courses, and to even do my public art project that I did in the UK, to add an educational component. Because I think, especially with Islamic geometric design, people think it's going to be really difficult. I mean, I'm sure you all have that as well when you do your workshop. People think, oh, it's going to be math, it's going to be hard. And then if you can present it in such a way that everybody gets to the finish line with a good result, it's great. Now it's a little bit different, because, of course, an opportunity came along to write something about Islamic architecture. So now, doing this session, for example, it's like reconnecting with with part of me that's been neglected for a couple of years because something else was going on. But it's, I still love it. I mean, I don't do a lot of art at the moment. Well, I write, that's art. I make books, that's art. But not, I don't sit down and draw very much. But there's different seasons in life, so it's fine. Um, that's my story, I guess.
I just pulled up.
Yeah, so this is my project in Dewsbury. Yeah, this is the thing. I have Craig to thank for that, I think. There's a funny story about that, I think, which I can talk about if there's a question about it. But this is the thing that we made for a educational centre in Dewsbury in Yorkshire, not very far from where I live, funnily enough. So it's all water jet cut ceramic tiles. A big fourfold pattern, or composition, I should say, not a pattern.
And that's something, it's based on a Moroccan pattern, but the colors is
Yeah, it's from a madrasa in Meknes. Really fantastic design, really fantastic fourfold design. But with a commission like this, because it's funded by the community, there's lots of people that you need to keep happy, different generations. And I really wanted to make something that's connected to the past, but also by using, for example, non-gloss tiles and using different colors to make it look like it also belongs in the 21st century. That was really the objective for me.
great. Thank you so much. And finally, Craig.
All right. Well, this is the book that Eric was talking about. Eric, I think I first met you in London at your book launch. If
Is it? Yes, that's right. That's right.
Because I happened to be living in London for the year on sabbatical.
Yes.
Can you go back to the?
Yes, sorry. Actually, but slideshow, I have to do full screen. Okay.
Go back to the first slide. I'm seeing. Yeah. So I wanted to, the early history here. I mean, I've always been interested in art, but I never studied art, and I've always been the math, computer science kind of bent. And I went to graduate student for computer science in computer graphics. I got sucked into graphics, and as it turns out, my supervisor, who had a broad interest in interdisciplinary work, organized a seminar course on ornamental design in computer graphics. And we had the good fortune of having a bunch of really great people join us for it, including Branko Grunbaum, who wrote the book literally on tiling theory. So that was important for my background. One day, somebody brought in a copy of Bourgoin's book, and this is, in fact, the Dover edition that Eric was referring to. And it's not really something I had ever seen or at least engaged with in the past, and it blew my mind because here was a volume of all kinds of patterns that were all beautifully distinct and each one interesting, and yet there were obviously rules that tied them all together. And it left me hungry to understand what those rules might be, and especially as a computer scientist, because if I could figure out the rules, then I could write an algorithm that embodied them, and that's what I sought to do. So then the next stroke of good luck was that in the art department at the University of Washington, somebody was offering an Islamic art course. So I signed up for that. That was Mamoun Sakal, who's a well-known Arabic calligrapher, mostly, among other things. And for the final project, I wrote my first piece of software to draw Islamic patterns based on Mamoun's recommendation that I look at this old paper by Tony Lee, by A.J. Lee, which for the first time gave me a not really compass and straight edge, but geometric construction of Islamic patterns that I could then embed in an algorithm. So now we can go to the next slide. And then just to show you some of the stuff I've done, my interest is much more on applying new math and CS ideas to broaden the aesthetic, the expressive range of what can be achieved in a medium that is still recognizably within the tradition of Islamic geometric patterns. So during my PhD, I worked on, for example, translating the construction of Islamic geometric patterns to non-Euclidean geometry. So here's more or less the same pattern in the Euclidean plane, in the sphere on the bottom left, and in the hyperbolic plane on the right. Next slide. I also, if you can create synthetic drawings of spherical designs, you can certainly realize them with 3D printing. So that becomes a nice opportunity to explore a thoroughly modern realization of what are otherwise fairly traditional patterns. And spherical designs aren't actually that common in traditional Islamic art. So it's interesting to see them in a context like this. These are both 3D printed spheres. Okay, going on from there. I also am very interested in these kinds of geometric transitions inspired by Escher's metamorphoses and parquet deformations, which were an exercise used in architecture and design by William Huff. And so here is an Islamic pattern that expresses the idea of a parquet deformation. So that's all fairly old work. And I think I've got two examples of very recent work to finish things off. So more recently, I've become specifically interested in the intersection of Islamic geometric art and what is sometimes called generative design, where you give the computer a little bit of autonomy, a little bit of agency, which you can think of, if you want, as just using randomness to create patterns that whose structure you don't explicitly control. So this was a project I worked on that became a paper for Bridges 2021 on procedurally generating random Islamic patterns in a Moroccan style, in this Zilij style that is related to the project you saw of Eric's. And another project, which is unpublished but is on archive, is using a mathematical technique called circle packing to create what we call free-form designs, where kind of unpredictable mixtures of stars and rosettes of different orders can somehow kind of negotiate the space that they share to look reasonably good, even though, you know, you're kind of trying to combine geometry that is ultimately irreconcilable. So it's this interesting relationship between the sort of the rather pure abstract geometry that we like to achieve in Islamic art and the compromises that are necessary when you try to do things that should not actually be possible. All right, so hopefully that's a good introduction. I'll leave it there.
Yeah, thank you so much. I mentioned I want to get one of those 3D printed.
I think you can still buy them on Shapeways, actually.
Yeah.
I can try to find one.
Look it up, I found, yeah.
Yeah.
Look really cool. Great. Well, thank you all so much. I think that was, sorry, that's the wrong way. Right. Stop my screen share. I think those were great introductions and already, you know, digs deep into some of the things I think we want to explore in the panel. And so keeping an eye on the time, I don't think I'll be able to get through all the questions, so I'll have to be somewhat selective from what I prepared, but I think you already have touched upon so much. So I want to start with, first of all, I guess maybe the practice of Islamic art. So more so the work that Samira and Eric do, which is actually doing some of the artistic work, although I know, Craig, you also generate art, but maybe in new ways, right? So we'll get to that in a bit. So for both Samir and Eric, maybe just, you know, briefly, it'd be great. Samir, we can start with you. But for both of you, the question is, what do you feel most differentiates your work from the traditional or historical practice of Islamic geometric design? I know you already sort of touched upon it maybe a little, but you could just say a few words about that. How are you interpreting things in new ways or doing something new?
Straight away, the materials that are available to me would make a big difference. So I work on paper. I use contemporary watercolors. They don't have to be anything handmade or anything particular in terms of the pigment. So straight away it becomes more easy for you to produce a piece. And I am a fast worker. So I like to produce a piece in one sitting. So often it's not large and it takes me a few hours. More complicated ones can take longer. So I think the thing that I think I do, which many others do as well, is just making it a far more accessible way to create patterns a lot quicker. So you don't need any specialist materials besides the compass and the straight edge on paper.
Great, thank you. And Eric?
I think the main difference between how I do it, but also how generally it's done nowadays compared to in the past. In one of the main things I think that in the past almost all geometric compositions were rectangular, and now as an artistic pursuit, quite often it's not. You know, they're more like some of the work that Samira shows. You know, they have a center and then there's a hexagonal shape around or some other shape. So they're more. It's a very different thing. It's a very different way of working. So that's a difference. There's a difference in materials, I think. I think there's also a difference in how we construct the pattern sometimes. You know, certainly the way that I have chosen to explain pattern construction is a way that I think is easiest for people to understand, but it's not always the way it might have been done in the past, which for me is fine. You know, I don't try to do that. I just try to make it accessible. I think those are the main the two main differences. And like Samira says, I mean, there's so many more opportunities to use different materials, and also with computers, of course, you know, there is so much more opportunity to play around and to experiment in ways that would not have been possible 100 years ago or 50 years ago.
Yeah, great. And I think on that note, for either of you, either or both of you can touch upon this, but have you ever come up with a beautiful geometric pattern that you don't think was discovered or used in the Muslim world? Because I know, you know, some of your work might be, you know, mimicking certain patterns, but have you ever like stumbled upon or tried to find a pattern that's novel? Like,
I wanted to share pictures of my discoveries, actually, so if I may. So this was a wall in Fez, and I was in the first instance I was recreating it, and let me see if I can click past this. So I did recreate it. However, later, maybe I'll say 2-3 years later, I was teaching it. So I was teaching this, that you can see there's a little coaster in the bottom, but I hadn't noticed that there was a difference between my drawing and the coaster. So I'll show you, there's a star here, and then around it you can see there's these hexagons. And on this one, it's not the same at all. I hadn't even noticed. So then I started thinking, this pattern that I've discovered by mistake, does it exist somewhere? And to this day, I haven't found it. I've found subtle variations, but this is the one. So this idea of discovering patterns by accident, I have done, definitely. And then, you know, with that, there's this idea that you've discovered something, so let's explore the variations. So then I did explore the variations and kind of realized that this is, the top half is from Morocco, and this one, is it by me, maybe? And I've had this discussion with other people. There's often this feeling you've discovered something, and then you set about trying to see where in the Islamic lands you might find it in architecture or in any of the books that I've mentioned. Will you find them? So sometimes you do. So you have that really lovely feeling, that discovery, but then you realize, somebody else has done it before me many times, and it's there in architecture. And then also with this idea, so I teach a lot of people online and in person. So when I present these ideas, I'm very transparent about the discovery, the mistake, that this, and then we all kind of have this idea of exploring together. So this pattern, essentially, is really simple. You can draw it on isometric paper, which is just paper made up of triangles. So then we were exploring how many variations you can do on that. So I loved this idea that from this era of mine, we were exploring. So it's the same painting, and this is typically the kind of thing I do. And I think, you know, this circular style motif isn't something that we'd have found in the past. This is another pattern, and this is a little more of a deliberate discovery. So this pattern at the center, it has 16, 1, 2, 3, 4, 16 petals, and it's surrounded by 6. Is that right? Yeah, I'm feeling like I'm lost the ability to count today. 12 and 6. Sorry. 12 and 6. The reason I was saying 16 is because I then decided I should try it out as in a different family of symmetry. And it wasn't my idea. I got an email from somebody commissioning me to do an artwork, and she said, could you do this pattern, but could you do it in 16? And I was like, oh, so this is quite a few years ago. And then I did basically apply the same rules from 12 and 6, but this time apply them to 6. Sorry, I'm about to say the wrong numbers. 16 and 8. Okay, so therefore the motifs, the sizes of them, their relative proportions, everything changes, and in essence it's the same pattern. So this is another way that I've been able to deliberately, not accidentally, discover new patterns. So yeah, this one is a discovery, and again, it wasn't something that I started. So I love this idea of how when you're back and forth with people in a community who are interested in these patterns, you can generate little ideas and suggestions and end up with new artwork. So yeah, I thought the visuals of this were interesting to share.
Yeah, wonderful. I'm really appreciative that you had the visuals to answer that question. That's great. Eric, do you have any stories?
I remember that in the first few years that I was trying to learn these patterns, that I would try and come up with something new, but almost invariably what I would come up with was worse than everything else that was already out there. And I mean, for me, there's a difference between patterns and compositions. And I think if I look at, for example, what Craig showed with these generative Zellage patterns, where you can create a structure and then you can fill in the shapes in the structure with different variables or mini patterns, I think that I find very interesting. I mean, for me, I gave up trying to find new patterns because, you know, if I was honest with myself, I was like, well, you know, it's not that great compared to what I'm studying. But trying to find new compositions, I find very interesting, because I think there's, especially with those Moroccan patterns, but also others, from other parts of the world, there's lots of opportunities to combine things in a way that hasn't been, well, I say hasn't been done before. The only things we can see are the things that are extant. But still, trying to find new compositions, but also by playing with scale, for example, that also makes a composition new. Nowadays with technology and manufacturing, we can make things much bigger and much smaller than in the past. So that creates it also. It presents these things in a new way, I think, even though the pattern might not be that original the way you present it would be.
And I think with color as well, I remember I've seen you give a talk before where you show like the same pattern with different colors. It looks like two different designs.
That's right. Yeah. It makes a big difference.
Right, wonderful. And Craig, to what extent do computers enable us to discover new patterns or new compositions, I guess, in an automated way? Like, and has this work happened yet? Are people, you or others, like trying to discover new patterns with computers, or is that not being
a little bit? I mean, first of all, for me, that's the whole point, right? Like I am not attempting necessarily to create finished artworks. I'm trying to find hidden degrees of freedom along which we might turn dials and find new patterns that didn't exist before. And so I definitely think computers allow us to do that. Most of the time for me, it's a matter of turning those dials into actual interactive controls that I fiddle with manually in the search of patterns that I like. It's not so much about writing a computer program and just turning it loose, trying to spit out new patterns, because I don't trust the computer to be a good judge of what's going to be visually interesting or knowing why something should be interesting. The generative stuff that more recently is maybe a bit of an attempt to let that happen more, to let the computer do more. But I absolutely think this is what computers are, going to help us to do, and it has been done a little bit. I had a project. I mentioned this in passing in the work I did on generative zilij. I had an undergrad working with me about 10 or 12 years ago, basically taking like generating borders of stars and softs, which is part of the method that we use with the patterns of that style, and then having the computer basically enumerate all the possible ways to fill those outlines with more zilij tiles. So this is perfect, right? The computer can grind away at this all day long and give us like the 15 things that you could actually possibly put here. And every now and then we would find something that, as far as I can tell, is not in the historical record. And so you're like, oh, that's something we could use maybe in a new design.
Interesting. You use the word generative. This is a little off script here, but do you think there's any opportunity, I don't know if opportunity is that word, any possibility of generative artificial intelligence creating these things? I mean,
yeah, I should be careful because the word generative has been almost completely taken over these days by AI generated imagery like DALL-E and Midjourney, Stable Diffusion, and so on, which these are all popular names now. To be clear, nothing I've said so far is about that. I was talking about really the older version of generative art in math and computer science, which is like inventing a system of rules and letting the computer play within those rules to create designs. But yeah, I think there is an opportunity. And in fact, every time I gain access to a new AI-based generative art tool, like the newest version of DALL-E or Midjourney or whatever, one of the things I ask is, show me a picture of, I always try to, you got to engineer the right prompt in this domain. So it's always something like an exquisite tile work fountain in the Moroccan style or something like that, to see the extent to which it understands the geometry of Islamic geometric patterns. And the results are occasionally interesting. It's never going to be something that we would properly recognize as like a pattern you would go back and construct with a compass and straight edge. But at times it really has the visual character at a glance of like Islamic architecture. I could try to pull up an example of what I'm talking about.
Yeah, we can pretty share it. We can move on, and then if you have it, cool to see. Yeah, because it's the way it works is so different. It doesn't. it doesn't operate in a way that's very methodical, right? And so it's very hard to sustain a pattern, I think, with these tools. But maybe it can generate something that can inspire an artist to then come up with the pattern.
It'd be cool to see, yeah.
Great, yeah, that was very interesting. Yeah, if you have an image, feel free to pull it up. But for now, I mean, this is a related topic. I'm going to move on to the sort of the intersection of the study of algorithms and Islamic geometry. And so, Carol, in your work, you suggest that the Muslim world began exploring a kind of, in your terms, algorithmic aesthetic. And I have a brief description of that, but maybe I'll just let you describe. Could you describe what you mean by an algorithmic aesthetic and how thinking in terms of algorithms might lead us to perceiving Islamic art differently?
Yeah, I wonder if I can show an image to illustrate what I'm talking about.
Yeah, please.
It goes back to the, no, let me see, stop share. That's not the one I wanted, just a moment. Somehow I'm losing you. Cheyenne, could you put up the introductory? It's the second slide of the introductory, and that would help me.
Yeah, I'll do that.
Thanks. For me, a pattern is a unit that is repeated according to a system, according to a means of organization. So I mentioned that symmetry is very often the system of organization in Islamic geometric patterns. The unit can be anything, and the slide that we'll look at when it comes up is the knot in a carpet, an individual wrapping of warp yarns in a carpet that is repeated, and then the color changes, and then that's repeated. So it's a sequence of knots that result in, let's see, yeah, it's the one behind that result in a pattern, and the pattern is repeated. So there beneath the woman, yeah, weaving, you see individual knots in two different forms, what's called a Turkish knot on the left and a Persian knot on the right, but that's not exactly correct because there's Persians who use the Turkish knot and Turks who use the Persian knot, but we won't get into that. But it's a unit that is repeated. And then if you show the larger slide, zoom back out, you can see several carpets on the left, and they show a design unit created by repetition of those knots in different colors, a design unit that is repeated according to a system. And that's what I mean by algorithm. So it's very much like a recipe. You do the same set of steps and arrive at the same dish that you serve for dinner. And here the steps are in the knotting of the carpet. In a textile, it's in setting up the loom to repeat a particular pattern. So that's what I mean about algorithmic aesthetic. And again, if we contrast this Islamic view with a Western view might just see repetition, and repetition is boring. But in these contexts, there's nothing boring about this repetition. And a lot of it is because there's both symmetry and symmetry breaking. So that's what I find important, and that's what lies at my understanding of algorithmic aesthetic.
Great, thank you so much. Craig, I mean, maybe you already sort of touched upon this, but as a computer scientist who studies Islamic geometric patterns, do you also see a sort of a close connection between these patterns and just sort of the abstract notion of algorithm? Like there's some like that these, I don't know, these patterns are sort of like personifying an algorithm in a visual way. I don't know if that's a well-formed question, but just curious to hear your thoughts.
It's a really interesting avenue for philosophizing, for pondering. I don't know that a finished pattern betrays its algorithm quite so readily. I mean, if it did, we wouldn't have spent as much time and effort as we have to try to unravel some of the mysteries of how these patterns were constructed in the first place. That being said, there are algorithms. I mean, algorithms do underlie the construction of these patterns in some sense. And certainly in my work, inevitably there's an algorithm. I almost never draw stuff step by step by hand. I'm literally writing computer software to draw it for me. Um, the thing that I find really fascinating is, like, I think you said something about this when you were communicating with us, was like, to what extent might this say something about the human mind representing these patterns algorithmically somehow? Um, I'm not sure that we are so explicit as to have like an algorithmic encoding of the information, of the visual information in a pattern, in a way that could be reduced down to something like software. But we do some kind of encoding. Symmetry, as Carol keeps referring to, is one kind. It's a way to factor out redundancy. It's a kind of encoding of information into a smaller package of information from which you can obtain, in some sense, an arbitrarily large pattern. And that's not as rigid as a step-by-step algorithm, but it is a way to represent a lot of information with, like, relatively less information. And I think we do that psychologically, like perceptually, we do that kind of encoding. And there's a lot of nice theories throughout the centuries of research on aesthetics to suggest that the effort, the cognitive effort of performing that encoding informs our appreciation of whatever it is we're looking at, of the pattern, so that we tend to appreciate designs that are not too complex and not too boring. And maybe Islamic art happens to be good at falling into that sweet spot.
Very interesting. Yeah. Just the work that I mentioned is there's some very recent work in cognitive science, I guess, that suggests that when we perceive a shape, and they haven't analyzed Islamic geometric art, so I think that might look different there. But, like, some patterns that some relatively simple patterns maybe that have been used historically, and when people look at that, like the amount of time it takes them to process correlates with, like, the minimum description length of the algorithm generates, which is fascinating. It suggests that our mind is actually doing algorithm. I don't know. It's I think there's going to be more work in the next few years, like unpacking that a little bit, but it's a very interesting, at least, hypothesis.
Yeah, the minimum description length stuff, it ties into some really deep ideas in information theory and computer science, almost paradoxically, because, of course, minimum description length, although it's an idea in computer science, it is something that you can prove is not computable. So we're clearly not doing that in our heads, but we might be doing something to approximate it.
Right. That's very interesting. So I'd like to jump forward to talk a little bit about the spirituality of this art form, the spiritual aspects of it. So first of all, Carol, could you say, as a historian who studied this, can you say a bit about the spiritual and religious significance behind Islamic geometry, and to what extent do we have evidence for the actual religious motivations, and to what extent do we have to actually speculate on what the motivations might have been that led to the emergence of some of these patterns in this art form?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and the answer is not so easy. I myself am not a Muslim. I'm not a spiritual practitioner, and the challenge for me is how to arrive at a scholarship of spirituality in a more objective academic framework. And the two ways that I have come to appreciate that, one is in the study of inscriptions that are selected to be inscribed in architectural monuments. And one Quranic passage in particular that is inscribed on the tower at Karakan that I mentioned briefly earlier has the word in it, amsal, which is usually translated as parables or similes. And these are the parables by which we ask men to reflect. But if you examine that word, it's a plural form of matal, which is also the term used for geometric patterns. And I would argue, but it is a speculative argument, that that passage was selected precisely because of the tens of patterns, I think it's 78 patterns on that one building, that are constructed of cut brick. So to me, there's a relationship between the Quranic passages and the geometric pattern, such that the geometric pattern almost serves as commentary for the Quran. And that is a key link for me. The other is in the repetition, like a verbal, a zikr, a repetition, a remembrance of God. The very first intersection of dodecagrams, 12 pointed stars intersecting with one another to create a polygonal network. At the center of each of the 12 pointed stars intersecting with one another is the name Allah, the name of God. And that is repeated in a tetractys, 1, 2, 3, 4 intersections of 12 pointed stars with the name of God. And that is also referred to in esoteric commentary, where the individual letters of the name of God, Aleph, Lam, Ha, are related to the vertical, the horizontal, and the spatial dimension, the concavity. So that there's, again, dots that one can establish that create links between art and spirituality.
That's very interesting. I didn't know about that last piece. Where is that? Where is that? Art?
That was from the esoteric commentary of Shahristani, and it's translated as Keys to Arcana by Toby Meyer.
And the actual the art, the decagonal pattern that you said, is that a piece? Is that in some architecture?
Yeah, I can show that if you'd like.
Sure. And maybe while you're pulling that up, in the interest of time, Samira, I was wondering if you could comment about, you know, as a Muslim, does drawing Islamic geometric patterns have a spiritual significance for you? Or some kind of,
Yeah, I think the pattern, by the way, that Carol might be referring to, I've seen it in the Alhambra. And
Oh,
it's
maybe. No, mine
yeah.
is from Farrakhan.
Oh,
oh, okay,
okay.
okay.
But you know the one when you described the visuals of the stars and with Allah written in the middle, I immediately visualized something that perhaps could be it as well. So, for me, what I find really interesting and what I really like about what you said, Carol, is we can speculate as to the how and the why. What I find really interesting is as a personal connection to me, if I want to do something very Muslim, very spiritual, I turn to the Quran and I turn to my prayers. So for me, I have a fulfillment of that through oh, that is the same pattern. Isn't that amazing?
Oh, you'll have to send me or share with me the
Yeah,
one in Alhambra.
it's the same pattern. Amazing. When you described it, because you described it like exactly as what I was visualizing. So yeah, so for me, although I get a lot of, I would say, um calmness, like a meditative state, you can almost feel yourself relaxing into the repetition of it and gaining something so beautiful from that. You know, the time I spend drawing and painting is just, wonderful. So for me, it has all a sense of spirituality, but not to the fullest extent. However, when I'm talking to other artists and other friends who practice the art, they would feel it to a more extent or a lesser extent. So I think there's quite an individual kind of connection as to what we gain and what we get from the practice. And another thing I think that Carol said is this sense of repetition. You know, when we do pray, there are times when we just are repeating and reciting the same things, zikr, the names of God, or glorifying God. So sometimes when you're drawing and getting into that flow state of creating an artwork, you do get that sense of zikr as well. So for me, like I know it's something that people will feel to a greater or lesser extent. When I talk to my friends who aren't Muslim and they're practicing the art form, they often describe things that I can relate to. When I know friends who have no spirituality kind of as something they would describe themselves as, there's a commonality. So I think there is something that we get from it that could be described as a spirituality, but I think there's enough variation and there's enough of a spectrum of that for us to kind of feel it in our own ways as well. I often think it's really difficult when artists especially are very like, this is why we did, this is how it was that, and then you'll find scientists or historians who are a little bit more speculative. I prefer that in terms of how we approach these things.
Wonderful. Yeah, it seems like in both in how these patterns were created and in the motivations behind it, we have to be a bit speculative, and the
Yeah.
work that you all are doing is trying to uncover, but we really don't. There's a lot that we don't know with certainty. But I'd like to open it up in case anyone in the audience has questions. I'll start with anyone in person, and if there are none, then we can go online. But I wanted to ask the panelists: Are you? I don't know if you have to leave right at 12, at least 12 this time zone, or if you're allowed, if you're able to stick around for a few more minutes. But.
Fine.
Okay, then we might have time for a few questions, but if anyone here has to leave, feel free to leave as well. So any questions from the audience for any of our panelists? Yeah, Adam.
So I guess historically and terminologically, why do we call it Islamic art rather than, I don't know, Middle Eastern art? If presumably this is a term from the West. Well, why do we settle on Islam?
A great question. Could you hear the question?
Yeah, I think it's, simply put, it's a sort of shorthand, and I don't think it's something everybody would agree on. So there'll be many opinions as to, no, this is this form or that form. So, having sometimes a shorthand name is very useful, but as soon as you have that, you also have many reasons why it might not be useful. So Islam, as in from all the way from Andalusia, North Africa, to Indian subcontinent and so much in between, Islam was a commonality, or ruled by Muslims was a commonality. So, I think it's a useful term, but I know from online, there's people who will disagree with me 100% and say something else. And I think all of you, Eric, you were about to say something as well. So, yeah.
I mean, the question comes up a lot when you do workshops and also when you write books. Is it Islamic art? Is it Islamic architecture? Is it Islamic geometric design? It's the way I describe it is that it's the least bad term, because what else would we call it? Because we could say, okay, we're going to call it Marinid geometric design or Seljuk geometric design or Mamluk geometric design, but then you get much too specific. When I was writing my book on Islamic architecture, I called the book myself, what did I call it? Architecture of Muslim Societies or something like that. But then when the book needs to be published, the title needs to be much more catchy, and I don't have a say over the title, and they call it Islamic architecture. And like Samira says, it's shorthand for something. At least people know what it's about, although it's not adequate. But it's, like I said, it's the least bad thing that we can come up with. I think that's the situation, really. It's just to find a term that everybody will understand, although not everybody will agree.
I know sometimes historians use terms like, I don't know, Islamic or something, or like, it's like not directly about Islam, but it's basically the societies that practice Islam, but that's too maybe technical of a term. But yeah, that's a really good question, I think. Thank you for asking. Any other questions? Any questions online? I'd like to, maybe we can end with this, but because I mentioned one thing I wanted to get at was Craig, I mentioned your breakthrough discovery, which is, it's actually a little bit outside the scope of this topic, but I wanted to connect it. In our last workshop, we talked about the relationship between artisans and mathematicians. Particularly, we discussed the work of Abul Wafa al-Buzjani, who basically attended these meetings between artisans and mathematicians in 10th century Baghdad. And he described the reasons that geometers and artisans needed each other. So like basically, geometers do mathematical proofs, they can prove if the construction's correct. Artisans come up with the nice designs, but then they don't really necessarily know the mathematics. As Eric said, he's not necessarily much of a mathematician, although I imagine now you're quite fluent in a lot of this, but they don't necessarily know how to prove if it's if some of the properties of the constructions are correct. And it's very, very interesting to see that this connection existed in the Muslim world across centuries. Actually, these two parties would meet and they would discuss with one another. They would they would bring their relative strengths. And I sort of saw a parallel with this recent discovery that, and maybe you can speak to it a little bit, but basically, so the audience is aware. So Craig, was involved in this discovery of a single tile, which is endearingly called the hat tile, I believe. Oh, you have it, right? Nice. That's 4 hat tiles.
Well done.
So it's become sort of like a cultural icon in a niche circle of people who are interested, I guess, in tiles, and you can find on the internet. But so this hat tile, what's fascinating about it, and we talked about tilings and aperiodic tilings a little bit in our last session. It can aperiodically tile the plane, but it's a single tile that can do this. And for this people did not know if such a tile existed. There were Penrose tiles, which were 2 tiles that could do this. That was discovered in the 20th century. And until last year, I think nobody knew. I don't even know if people thought it did or did not exist, but maybe you can speak to that. But what's fascinating to me is basically, as I understand it, someone came up with David Smith, was a hobbyist of sorts who discovered this tile. So we could say similar to an artisan of, analogous to an artisan. He discovered this tile and then reached out to you and said, can you prove that this actually aperiodically tiles the plane? And then you and a few other mathematicians worked on that, and in fact, you did prove it. So can you speak to that a bit? And I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about that what happened there, and also, is there room today for hobbyists, amateurs, artisans to work with mathematicians in this way, to come up with new ideas, to work together, either in tiling or other areas of Islamic geometric patterns, et cetera?
I mean, to answer the last part first, evidently yes, because I did that, and it was one of the most successful moment in my career up to this point, and probably ever. Although give me a minute to try to do something else, I guess. To summarize the story, I don't want the hat to. Here's another one. I don't want it to take over this event, but. Yes, the question of whether a single shape could tile the plane aperiodically had been open since roughly the 1960s. Penrose tiles, the very first examples of aperiodic sets, the very first one had 20,000 tiles. Then within 10 years, they had gotten it down to 2, and nobody could take the final step to 1. And in fact, a lot of people conjectured that it was impossible. And then in 2022, David Smith, also in Yorkshire, East Yorkshire though, found a shape that he needed help understanding, and that shape turned out to be the aperiodic monotile we had been looking for. He knew enough to be suspicious and wonder because the shape wasn't behaving the way he normally expected, but not a mathematician and didn't have the computational tools to sort of make it work and to see how it behaved over longer ranges. So he and I worked on that, but then to write the actual mathematical proof, we brought in we recruited Chaim Goodman Strauss and Joseph Myers, who really provided the mathematical muscle. But yeah, David is not a mathematician. He's definitely a hobbyist who plays with shapes, but he has really good intuition for this stuff, and he did what he needed to do, which is he had something he didn't understand, and he reached out to me, and we were able to start making progress towards an answer. And I certainly hope there's unlimited room for those kinds of alliances to form spontaneously online. I certainly don't think that research ought to be just purely the domain of academics and trying to do gatekeeping on what's valid and what's not. We have to be a little bit careful because the internet's a big place and there are lots of people who have, let's face it, crackpot theories that you have to dismiss, ignore, just kind of like file away for later. Luckily, I recognize that what David had was very far from a crackpot theory.
Yeah.
It also depends a lot on the area. Tiling theory happens to be this really elegant, immediate kind of theory where you can play with shapes on a piece of paper and make recognizable progress on a problem. And this is compared to, let's say, number theory, for example, like the Riemann hypothesis or ABC conjecture, where you need an immense amount of mathematical background and notation and theorems and all the machinery of math to even understand the question correctly, much less to try to make a dent in the answer. Whereas with tiling theory, drawing the right picture can be the answer. And that's sort of how things happen for us.
Great, yeah, thank you so much. And yeah, I think it's a really fascinating story. Hopefully be inspiring to others. And so maybe we can end with this. Eric or Samira, did you have any moments like this where Samira, you mentioned some of the discoveries you made, where you came up upon something, you're like, I need to talk to a mathematician about this. Does that ever happen in your work, or no? It's just you're just drawing art and we go. Yeah. Oh, you're muted.
I think I'm pretty intimidated by some of the maths because it was like I was a high school math teacher and I've even forgotten what I taught like inside out. So when some words are said, I'm like, this is vaguely familiar. I'm not sure. So no, I kind of would put a black kind of a block on such things. And I also think I'm a lifetime learner. So if I don't fully get something, I just kind of set it aside for later and hope that later on it'll make more sense. And that's happened to me with other subjects, with other patterns that are a little bit more complex. So I'm happy to just kind of go at a steady pace, and anything a little bit too complicated, either kind of swerve away or kind of leave for later.
Yeah, Eric, do you have any?
For me, it's more if I come across things that relate to maths or geometry, but not geometric patterns, it piques my interest because I think, how can I explain this with visuals and not equations? For me, I love that challenge. And when I was writing my book for Islamic architecture, I made a really big appendix that I hoped would be included, but in the end wasn't included, with things about explaining certain proportions, of obviously the golden ratio proportion, but how you can find that in architecture specifically or in pattern specifically, the silver ratio, how proportions were used, or how a compass and a ruler and the proportions that they generate simply were used for the expansion of the Mesquita in Cordoba, for example. Lots of things like that. It might end up being a little book on its own. I mean, that's what I like. It doesn't happen really that if I come across something that I think, okay, a mathematician needs to help me out here, although, maybe I should, but it's more like, okay, how can I make this accessible in a way that the average person will understand? And then sometimes I manage, I think, but sometimes I don't.
Is the mathematics already figured out, and and then you have to come up with a way to represent it that's more accessible, or do you have to actually do some math to figure out what's going on?
No, I don't do maths.
Right.
No, it's just circles and lines and the shapes that they generate.
Yeah.
Stan,
Yeah.
I wonder if I could add my own footnote here. Going back to Plato in his dialogue called Timaeus, he identifies two ideal triangles. The first is the right isosceles triangle, 45, 45, 90, as we would call it. And the second is the 30, 60, 90, half an equilateral triangle. And I'm continually fascinated. How did Plato figure that out? I mean, if you go into an architecture and engineering store today, those are the two triangles that you can purchase.
Mm-hmm.
And he figured it out way back when, 2,500 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
Also, one thing I'd like to add is, often sometimes we set aside geometry and pattern as though it's not maths. It literally is maths. That doesn't require all the algebra or the equations or, the kind of the stuff that other maths needs. So sometimes on behalf of geometry, I'm like, it is mathematics, and I love it for its immediate visual kind of ability to communicate, that you see pattern, you see repetition, you see lines of symmetry, you see rotation, and you are doing maths in all of that quick having a look and analyzing it. I think sometimes I remember one book where there was all this additional trigonometry besides everything, and I thought, yes, that's lovely, but you don't need it to understand this geometry. So you can actually think of this as one of the oldest subjects in maths. It's one of the oldest. You just need a compass and a straight edge. And then even that you don't need. You could just visually be able to explore its qualities and symmetry, repetition, pattern, and so on. It's maths. So yeah, this is one of the things I think we have a sense of, maths is so much broader now. There's some subjects that, I think Craig was listing. I thought, I don't even know what they are because there's so many subjects in maths, but this is one of the oldest.
Right, and I think that speaks to the elegance of it, that it's something that anyone can visualize at least, and beyond that, most people can draw it, it takes some effort, but you can learn to do it without really thinking about the math behind it. And I think by exploring it, you can delve deeper into math, the beauty of mathematics, right? It's a good entry point for many. I think that's one reason that Islamic geometry is has this aesthetic power, and it draws many in. And I think there's been an upsurge of interest maybe, I don't know if it's during the pandemic or before that, but a lot of people, learning, how to construct these patterns and getting interested in it. So thank you
Yeah.
so much. Are there any final questions from anyone in the audience, online or in person, before we wrap up? I hope this was, you all enjoyed this as much as I did. I think we learned a lot from your expertise. So thank you to our panelists. Let's give a round of applause for all the panelists. I really appreciate your time and for speaking to us today. Hopefully I can, put up the recording in some accessible way online so others can learn from this as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shayan.
Thank you.
Take care, everyone.
It's been a pleasure.